Media Narratives. I'm George Samueli. It is now 9:12 p.m. in, yes, cold, grim, sunless, lightless, dayless, dreary Budapest. As we head towards the shortest day of the year. So, with that depressing introduction out of the way, thank you everyone who has joined me. Welcome to the Gaggle. And a few things I want to touch on today. And I don't know whether anyone has had a chance yet to look at the podcast that I recorded earlier today with Dragana Trifkovic from Belgrade. She's the director of the Center for Geostrategic Studies in Belgrade. And as you may have seen, she and I don't exactly see eye to eye on current events in Serbia. She's much more uh, hostile to Alexander Vucic, the Serbian president, than I am, and much more sympathetic to the protesters over the uh, uh, somebody is, Peter Kovic says, is the weather in the UK better than in Hungary? It's very hard to say. I think that it's in Hungary, the spring and the summer are quite nice. I do think there's a lot of sun. The the fall and winter in Hungary are really very grim. There's not a lot of sun here. So, and there, I think the UK is better. So, I think spring, summer, better in Hungary than in the UK. But fall, winter, I think probably UK is a little bit better. Um, but anyway, now the problem that I have, and I've had this problem with Serbs over many years, that they have a tendency of making the perfect the enemy of the good. In other words, you absolutely hate the current leader, and you hate that leader so much, you think that somehow he's selling out Serbia and Serbian national interests so much that step by step you're really batting on the side of the enemy. Um, and I mean, this was obviously the case during the 1990s when I used to come across all the time in the United States Serbs who absolutely loathed Milosevic, absolutely hated him, and were convinced that somehow Milosevic was selling out Serbia, selling out the Serbs in Bosnia, selling out Serbs everywhere. It was the worst thing ever to the Serbs. And they reached the point of actually supporting NATO's campaign against Serbia. Absolutely was supporting it. Absolutely, they thought this is great because somehow it's going to hurt Milosevic. They weren't even able to think beyond that. I think, yeah, but it's actually going to hurt Serbia. Um, and and so they're so worked up about it that they don't even care that much about the NATO bombing. They didn't seem to care that much about it because somehow it was bad for Milosevic. And then when Milosevic was overthrown, obviously in a Western orchestrated coup, the color revolution was clearly Western orchestrated. They rejoiced, absolutely rejoiced. Wonderful, wonderful. When Milosevic was then carted off to The Hague, an eternal shame to the Serbian people, incidentally. And Serbs aren't going to be able to, wash that stain off their national reputation. They handed him over. The Croats didn't do that. Croats never handed over their political leaders. No one else did that except the Serbs. They handed him over to the Hague, and he Milosevic took it upon himself to defend the national honor of the Serbs. He did it all by himself. I mean, he obviously he got help from his various political advisors, one of whom is a regular on the Gaggle. We had him on a few times. Um, and but the Serbs were just rejoiced about this, and so you can get yourself so worked up about things that you're effectively, you know, what you say is now almost indistinguishable from what you read in the Guardian, what you read in the Nation. Um, Vucic, without question, is not a great character. He's not. He's not the most courageous um, political leader that the Serbs have had. But his attempt to get some investment into Serbia to have a Trump Tower built over what is basically an eyesore. This whole thing, that this building that was destroyed in Belgrade, which was the Ministry of Defense of Yugoslavia, and it was destroyed during the 1999 bombing, and that somehow this has now become a memorial. You look at it; it's an eyesore. It's an eyesore in the middle of Belgrade. I mean, there should be memorials. Absolutely, there should be memorials built in Belgrade to commemorate the 1999 bombing. But that isn't the memorial. That's just an eyesore. So I didn't see any reason why it was such a bad idea to just remove this rubble and build, a Trump Tower and whatever, a casino. And what she was saying. Oh well, it was the Americans, and this is Trump Tower, and somehow it was the Americans who led the bombing, and so on, and that's all true enough. But it wasn't Trump. Trump really wasn't um, one of the bomb the Serbs figures from the 1990s. In fact, he really didn't say much about the Serbs. During the time, this was during the 1990s. Anyone who remembers those days will recall that the hysteria about the Serbs was just off the charts. I mean, it's even worse than the hysteria about Russia today. And but Trump really wasn't part of that. I don't remember him ever saying anything about bombing the Serbs. Now, so I don't find that argument terribly compelling, other than those people who hate Vucic. Now, who are the people who hate Vucic? Now, I don't really think that those are great Serbian patriots, who um, uh, who somehow cannot get out of their system the horror that was perpetrated by NATO in 1999. I don't think those are the people. I think this is the sort of the opposition, the Western-led opposition that wants to come back and wants to essentially the continuation of that the DOS, the Democratic Opposition of Serbia, that came to power after the coup against Milosevic. So I just don't find any of these claims, the hysteria that is being generated in the media by some of these Serbs about this memorial that has to be preserved in perpetuity, where it's just a pile of rubble. I don't find this believable at all. I think this is an attempt at staging a coup and trying to get the Serbian nationalists on board. It's quite a smart move in its own short-sighted way. I mean, it's quite a smart move. But these kind of liberal Serbs, these oppositionist Serbs, they are the scum of the earth. I mean, not the guest today. She's not one of them. But I know the types. They get these academic positions in various universities in the West. And when they get these professorships, these Serbs, what do they do with these professorships? They tell them how terrible the Serbian people are. The Serbs, they're still mired in their nationalistic, self-pitying rubric, with all their worshipping of Milosevic and Karadzic and their war crimes and their racism and their ethno supremacy, and of course their patriarchy. But don't forget patriarchy, patriarchy, patriarchy. That's what they do. That's what these professors do. I know them. They're the most awful people in the world. And then they get quoted in perpetuity in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. Whenever there's some negative story, and every story about Serbia is a negative story, and these people then get the quoted. Oh, Professor so and so from I think is it Subotic? Yeah, I think Yelena Subotic is a classic of that. I think she's a professor at some southern university, I mean, maybe in Georgia. I think Yelena Subotic. So she's always quoted in the New York Times, and of course she writes about patriarchy in Serbia, the denial of women's rights in Serbia, and of course the extreme misogyny that prevailed in Yugoslavia. So those are the types. So those are the types who rose to power after the overthrow of Milosevic. Now, whatever the shortcomings of Vucic, I mean, he's still better than those people, and that's really the problem. Is that when you get these people like Dragana who just hate Vucic so much, they're just opening the door to the return to power of those creatures who took over in 2000. Anyway, I just want to show you the latest on this whole thing with the collapse of the Kushner deal. I think I'm no fan of Kushner, to say the least. But I failed to see that there was anything wrong with this deal. And by sabotaging this deal, by making sure that this deal fails, a lot of money. Serbia is not a rich country. It's a lot of money that's now Serbia has been denied. No one else is going to come in with this investment. That's going to be there. No one's going to touch it. Because hey, I don't want to get my get my fingers burned with this one. And so here is the Guardian. Again, the Guardian. These are all professional Vucic. I mean, they hate Vucic. That's what they. If they're not denouncing Orban, they're denouncing Vucic. So Orban, Vucic, and Putin. They're the three. I don't know, demons in the world view of the Guardian and Politico and the New York Times and so on. So that's why if you're going to be a nationalist, you've got to be careful that you're not really just opening the door to the people who really hate the Serbs. But anyway, here is the Guardian from today. And as you say, Serbian president threatens reprisals after plans for Belgrade Trump Tower thwarted. And then development abandoned after Serbian minister indicted over $500 million project. So the indictments, these indictments are obviously just fakery. I mean, they're just part of lawfare that's now de rigueur pretty much everywhere. You don't like your political opponent, so you bring criminal charges. But in this case, they brought it against the minister, which only goes to show that how limited Vucic's grip on power really is in Serbia. I mean, again, the media always present it as, oh, Vucic is a dictator, he's an authoritarian, totalitarian. But in reality, he's not even in charge of his own government. I mean, his own minister gets indicted, and obviously, kind of fake charges. Here we are, Serbia's authoritarian ruler. So he's always, they already shove it in right in the beginning. Serbia's authoritarian ruler. He's so authoritarian that he can't even control his own prosecutors. He's so authoritarian that he's unable to get a business deal done because of the protesters. He's so authoritarian that he hasn't been able to do anything about these year-long protests over an accident in the Novi Sad railway station that had absolutely nothing to do with him. But he's always get the sobriquet right, authoritarian. In a rare setback for the Trump family's global money-making campaign, the 500 million development was abandoned after Monday's indictment of a Serbian minister on suspicion of abusing his office to support the project. And then Vucic says, "We have lost an exceptional investment. I will personally ensure that everyone who participated in causing this damage is held accountable." Well, good luck with that. That ain't gonna happen. The site had protected status as a place of cultural heritage. Once a gem of modernist architecture, it was preserved as the ruins of the genocidal Slobodan Milosevic regime military headquarters bombed by NATO in 1999. So this is a news report from The Guardian, and I'll read this again. Once a gem of modernist architecture, it was preserved as the ruins of the genocidal Slobodan Milosevic's regime's military headquarters bombed by NATO in 1999. So there's several things that one should note about that. The Guardian is obviously rejoicing that this deal has fallen through. Because, if it's bad for Vucic, if it's bad for Serbia, then the Guardian is happy. The Guardian has been hating the Serbs ever since ever since the late 1980s, ever since Slobodan Milosevic kind of rose to prominence. Now, so that's it. So therefore, those people, the really these nationalists, these Serbian nationalists, who hate Vucic and who are also rejoicing over the failure of this project, the collapse of this project. These are your allies. These are your allies. So you're rejoicing about something that's clearly bad for Serbia. Serbia's not going to get this money. You're rejoicing along with the Guardian. These are your political allies. Why is the Guardian rejoicing? We know why it's rejoicing. It's rejoicing because this is bad for Serbia. It's bad for Vucic. It'll probably weaken Vucic politically. So it'll weaken the sort of the nationalist politically. And they think this will facilitate the return to power of the DOS crowd, the Democratic Opposition of Serbia crowd. I don't know whether you will, but that's their calculation. Now, so that's obviously one thing. The second thing is that here is the Guardian that describes Milosevic as genocidal. Now, leave aside the sort of hysteria, emotionalism of using such a term in a news report. This isn't from one of those clowns, from Sarajevo who've been screaming genocide, genocide, genocide since the 1990s. This is the Guardian. So it describes him as genocidal. Now, the ICTY, the International Criminal Tribunal for the Former Yugoslavia, an awful, politically motivated court, politically inspired, politically motivated, and driven by the Ahmadovich says, "I need George's patience every time he reads the Guardian." It's very hard. You're absolutely right. It's very hard to to maintain an even keel. I mean, I'm not all that good at maintaining an even keel, but yeah, it's hard work when you read the Guardian and Politico. Um, so they describe it as genocide. So the ICTY, which was thoroughly, I mean, it targeted almost exclusively the Serbs. I mean, it threw out a few bones by indicting some Kosovo Albanians and some Bosnian Muslims, but they usually just walked. Either they were convicted and then their conviction was overturned on appeal, or if they were convicted, they just got a rap on the knuckles. But basically, it was a one-sided uh, uh, project to demonize and convict the Serbs through for all eternity. Now, because the only people who were ever indicted and convicted for genocide were Serbs, and pretty much so the leaders, among Republika Srpska leaders, so Mladic, Karadzic, um, and then one or two figures within the Bosnian Serb army, um, who convicted of genocide. But now, Milosevic never was convicted of genocide. Not one leader in Serbia proper, rather than Bosnia and Herzegovina. Not one leader within Serbia. None. Milosevic, Sinovic, was it Frankie? Oh God, name escapes me. Milutinovic, who were convicted by. Actually, Milutinovic was acquitted, but the ones who were convicted, who worked for the Serbian government rather than the Bosnian Herzegovina, the ones who worked for the Serbian government, not one of them was ever convicted of genocide. Now, it's true that Milosevic was indicted for genocide. Totally ridiculous, a total idiotic indictment. But nonetheless, he did stand trial for genocide. And Milosevic did die before the trial came to its conclusion. But nonetheless, he was never convicted of genocide. So, and no one else within the government in Belgrade was ever convicted on genocide. So the Guardian throws this in there: the genocidal regime of Slobodan Milosevic. Just toss it in there. Just as if this is now perfectly acceptable to describe the Serbian government in this way. So, as I say, these are your allies. So if you go around rejoicing that somehow is bad for Vucic, you're aligning yourself with the Guardian. These are people who they have no goodwill for the Serbs whatsoever. They hate the Serbs. They see the Serbs as a stand-in for Russia. They just culturally, socially, they just regard them as barbarians. But more important, they see them as a stand-in for Russia. So when you kind of denounce Vucic and then say, "Oh, he's so unpatriotic. He's not he is unpatriotic because he's not preserving this eyesore in the middle of Belgrade. He wants to bring in some investment." And let's keep in mind, as I said this on Tuesday, he was a member of that government. He was a member of the Milosevic government in 1999, the one that was being bombed. He was the information minister. And so, therefore, he was personally affected by the bombing. He could easily have been killed. And as I pointed out, he very nearly was killed. He was supposed to be at the RTS building on the night that the RTS building was attacked by NATO. So that was when they attacked The RTS building was in April the 23rd, I think. Anyway, and he was supposed to be there giving an interview to Larry King, but for some reason, we don't know why exactly, he canceled at the last minute. Somebody may well have tipped him off. What about the coming bombing? So anyway, but nonetheless, his life was in some danger through his position. All right, so these protesters who supposedly care so much, and you can read this in the Guardian. There's a Guardian which fraudulently expresses this great sympathy for the protesters in Belgrade because they care so much to preserve the memorial to the 1999 bombing, the very 1999 bombing that the Guardian supported eagerly, enthusiastically, zealously, and to this day defends it with a passion. That's why they call it the genocidal regime. Anyway, let's go on with the Guardian. So regime, genocidal, Slobodan Milosevic. Notice again the way they throw around this word genocidal. Keep in mind, that's why I've been telling people, quit with all this talk about genocide. I know you don't like Israel. I don't like Israel very much. I don't like Netanyahu. I don't like what Israel has been doing in Gaza. I know all of that. Don't play this game of throwing around the word genocide. You're always going to get hurt by it. 9 days after Trump's November 2024 election victory, the Vučić regime revoked this protected status. But the necessary paperwork has been falsified, the head of the Cultural Heritage Institute said after his arrest in May. Vučić spoke darkly of corrupt gangs of prosecutors bringing fabricated cases, as if, heaven forbid, that can't possibly be true when we know exactly that's what prosecutors are. They are indeed corrupt gangs and they bring fabricated cases. But the prosecutor, Mladen Nenadic, pressed on. He made further arrests, culminating on Monday in the indictment of Vučić's culture minister, Nikola Shilakovic, and other officials in connection with the illegalities in the removal of the status of cultural property from the site of the planned Trump Tower. And then here is Deutsche Welle. Deutsche Welle, it's an interesting thing, and I was thinking the other day, that Germany is now becoming gradually the stupidest country in Europe. Whatever else one used to say about the Germans, there's obviously a lot of, obviously a lot of negative things people used to say about the Germans. But the one thing no one ever really accused the Germans of being is stupid. No one ever said the Germans were stupid. They may be obnoxious, they may be offensive, they may be arrogant, they may be aggressive. No one ever said that they were stupid. But when you read Deutsche Welle, when you listen to Friedrich Merz, when you listen to Annalena Baerbock, Miss 360 Degrees, you think these people are dumb. I mean, they just don't even understand how that everything they say makes no sense, and it contradicts everything else that they say. So here's this Deutsche Welle story. It says Trump's son-in-law backs out of Serbia construction project. Popular protests and a corruption investigation have prompted Jared Kushner's company to withdraw from a prestige construction project in the heart of Belgrade. Serbian President Aleksandar Vučić is furious. Serbia's President Aleksandar Vučić has long been accused of exercising total control over the Western Balkan country. So let's just savor this opening sentence. Serbia's President Aleksandar Vučić has long been accused of exercising total control over the Western Balkan country. How can he exercise total control over the Western Balkan country when, for more than a year, the country has been beset by these protests. Students are not going to classes; they're just boycotting the classes. Schools are not functioning because teachers prefer to stay at home to protest Vucic than to show up and teach classes. And so, but Vucic, he's exercising total control over this country, and the protests are ridiculous because Vucic has nothing whatever to do with what happened in Novi Sad. Now he has declared that he will personally file criminal charges against everyone he accuses of the economic sabotage of Serbia. Okay, well, I mean, it's fairly ridiculous. Um, that same day, Serbia's Public Prosecutor's Office for Organized Crime filed an indictment against the Minister of Culture, Nikola Shelakovic, and three other officials. So again, he exercises total control, but the public prosecutor can indict Vucic as Minister of Culture. Wow, this totalitarianism is really getting to me now. This is exactly the kind of thing Hannah Arendt was writing about. Totalitarianism, it's absolute totalitarianism. He controls everything, including the public prosecutor who is indicting his own minister. They are accused of unlawfully removing the cultural heritage status of the General Staff building. President Vucic, who has ruled Serbia with an iron fist. So he's exercising total control, and now he's ruled with an iron fist. That iron fist, strikingly absent during the year-long protest, and basically universities just shutting down. The iron fist notably lacking when some jerk of a prosecutor can indict his own minister. Iron Fist for 13 years and essentially controls the media, police, and judiciary. Reacted with anger. So he controls the judiciary, the very judiciary that has indicted his own minister. He controls the media, even though almost all of the media hate Vucic. And then, of course, the police, but the police they don't seem to be able to do very much about these protesters. Then he goes, the president announced that he would personally file criminal charges against all of those who participated in the witch hunt and the destruction of the investment, specifically including public prosecutors. We will now be left with a destroyed building, and it is only a matter of time before bricks and other parts start falling off it because no one will ever touch it again. Well, that's true. We'll just be left with a destroyed building and an eyesore in the middle of the city. You think it's a memorial to what NATO did? You think NATO gives a rat's ass that you've got a destroyed building in the middle of a city? You think they care? You think Mark Rutte? You think cares? You think Friedrich Merz cares? Kaya Kallas cares? That you're retaining this destroyed building in the middle of the city? Oh, Mark Rutte, oh, this is really embarrassing. I'm really upset about this. Marco Rubio. Whoa! This is terrible. I don't want to be reminded of what we did in 1999. We need to do something. No one gives a rat's ass. You're hurting yourself. I mean, you're hurting Belgrade by leaving this wreck in the middle of the city. Pro-government media went further still. Instead of Serbia, it said Kushner would now be investing in a project on the coast of neighboring Albania, which is true. He is investing in Albania. And it's interesting that no one is raising any issue about that. So the sort of talk, oh, well, there was some people who were defending why are you so happy that this deal has fallen through? Well, I'm so happy because this is Kushner. I don't like Kushner because I don't like Trump, so I'm really happy this deal fell through. Although that's all. That's the only reason I'm so happy this deal fell through, because I don't like Jared Kushner. Oh yeah. So how come you don't have a problem with his making money in Albania? Why aren't you protesting about that? The tabloid newspaper Informer takes the view that the blockers, the defamatory term for demonstrators who protested against the plans to redevelop the General Staff building, must be held accountable. But there is a lot more at stake than just the investment itself, which was reported to be worth 750 million euros. So that's like, that's a lot of money in a relatively poor country. Serbia has been rocked by massive popular protests for more than a year now. These started after the concrete canopy of the newly renovated railway station in Novi Sad collapsed in early November 2024, killing 16 people. Serbian students are at the forefront of the protest, and at times all the universities in the country were blockaded. Wow! But this is a totalitarian system. This is what, not only Hannah Arendt would recognize what the system of totalitarian. Zbigniew Brzezinski, the man who kind of popularized the concept of totalitarianism, along with Samuel Huntington. Yeah, they would have seen Serbia as the exemplar of totalitarianism. Hundreds of thousands of people have been demonstrating. Whew, this totalitarianism is really getting to me. Yeah, Arthur Koestler wrote about this, Darkness at Noon. The students have demanded elections and have prepared their own list of candidates. Opinion polls give the list a good chance of defeating Vucic's Serbian Progressive Party. So he rules with an iron fist, and yet, according to this Deutsche Welle, there's a good chance he's going to lose the next election. But see, that's always the way the media present these things, because, of course, an election is only a fair one if your desired candidate wins. So if Vucic wins, then obviously it was rigged. Just like if Orban wins, the election was rigged. If, however, under the same conditions, they have this hold an election and the opposition wins, then that was free and fair and legitimate. So a legitimate election is only legitimate if the pro-Western, the party endorsed by Western leaders, Western policymakers, Western media, that's when it's a legitimate election. If they don't win, then it was obviously rigged. Vucic has tried to discredit the protests as a colored revolution directed by the West, but has not provided any evidence of this. Well, maybe there may not be any evidence. I mean, maybe they just, maybe they have no idea what exactly they're doing. I'd be very surprised if the West was not involved in this. It would be the first of its kind that the Western intelligence agencies were not involved in this. Serbia is ridden through with Western intelligence agencies. I mean, that place is run by CIA, MI6, the French intelligence service. They run the place. So the idea that there are these protests taking place, there's no evidence that's directed by the West. Well, why do you think all these Western intelligence agencies have set up shop in Belgrade? Just because they enjoy the Belgrade cooking. Anyway, meanwhile, the Public Prosecutor's Office for Organized Crime is investigating not only the renovation of the main station in Novi Sad, but also the case of the General Staff building in Belgrade. Nenad Leibensperger, from Serbia's Institute for the Production of Cultural Monuments, as well as many of his colleagues, refused to remove the building from the register of cultural artifacts. And okay, so that's that. Okay, so you get the sense here that all of this is a gigantic fake. And what is it really about? I mean, what it's really about is they want to get Serbia into that NATO club. They want to get Serbia into NATO. It's a difficult one. They know it's a difficult one. So it has to be a long-term project. And so they have to replace Vucic by somebody who's much more amenable. I mean, it's not complicated, and they want to do the same thing in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and that's why they've essentially moved there to remove everything irksome about the Serbs in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So it's not complicated. My problem is that that the Serbs don't seem to understand the game that's being played, and they seem to think that the person who really isn't more nationalist than thou, more Serbian than thou, is the enemy, and and I think it's led Serbia to disaster after disaster. Also remember when in that terrible election in 2000 against Milosevic, Koštunica, the whole that democratic opposition of Serbia, united against Milosevic. They attacked Milosevic for essentially betraying the Serbs, and that he hadn't somehow supported the yeah, Richard first about the French intelligence service, exactly. So so they um, yeah, that he hadn't reacted, he hadn't supported the Serbs in Bosnia and Herzegovina strongly enough, and so the campaign that they waged against um, the the Milosevic was that he wasn't sufficiently nationalist. Now, so remember, Milosevic in the West, he was attacked for being this rabid Serbian nationalist. Totally ridiculous, totally fraudulent, but nonetheless, they attacked him as a rabid Serbian nationalist. But the same kind of the Western policymakers, the Western intelligence agencies, supported the opposition to Milosevic, the opposition that was attacking Milosevic for being insufficiently nationalist. And it was a very smart move. It was a very, very clever. That if they were to run a campaign attacking Milosevic for being too nationalist in Serbia, Milosevic would win. So the best way of defeating Milosevic was to accuse him of being insufficiently nationalist. And that's what they did. That's what Koštunica, Djindjic, and the whole of that crowd, the democratic opposition of Serbia, they attacked Milosevic for not doing enough to protect the Serbs. And then, first thing they did, was to reapply for membership of the United Nations. And why that's important was that, Milosevic had preserved the country's dignity by insisting that Yugoslavia, the state that he headed, Yugoslavia, was the successor state of the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, and also the successor state to the Kingdom of Yugoslavia that was destroyed by Hitler. And so he insisted on that, even at the price of getting kicked out of the United Nations. So these people, Koštunica, reapplied for membership and acknowledged that this state, the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, which then Koštunica set about destroying because very quickly there was no longer Yugoslavia, it was now called Serbia and Montenegro. So the term Yugoslavia was then destroyed, it just became known as Serbia and Montenegro, and then of course Montenegro went its own way, and that was that. But that was the first thing they did, was to essentially cancel essentially the national dignity that Milosevic had insisted upon by saying, we are the successor state to the SFRY. So, why there's a long kind of preamble to say, you got to be kind of accept things and be realistic. And not, if you just simply get worked up with all your hatreds for current political leaders, you're batting on the other team, and you're destroying your own country. You're not helping, basically. And I think that was very much my experience with the Serbs that I knew at that time in the 90s. They were not helping their country. They were actually weakening the country. They were being used as propaganda fodder by the West. Anyway, that's that out of the way. But the really exciting news is, of course, the meetings in Brussels today, the European Council, and their attempt to find some legal basis for stealing Russia's money. So remember, they've got this frozen sovereign assets, the central bank reserves, um, and the so these are central bank reserves in Europe, and they've been frozen since 2022, and basically the EU, and they don't know how to keep this war going. They don't have the money for it, and so they look at this 300 billion euros. I don't know if that's the sum. No one. It's always different sums that are thrown around, but so look at this 300 billion euros and say, well, hey, this will do nicely. We could use this against we could use this for Ukraine and keep the war in Ukraine going for a little bit longer. I mean, if we can just divide up the 300 billion into three 100 billion euro tranches, then maybe we can keep it going for another 3 years. The problem, of course, is that it's obviously theft. There's no way in the world any court is going to accept this as anything other than, as Ahmadovich says, what stealing? Ursula told us all this is legal. That's exactly it. Ursula has claimed that it is legal. So this convoluted nonsense. And remember, Ursula von der Leyen, she's not a lawyer. She has no idea. But Ursula von der Leyen came up with this wizard scheme whereby the EU would lend money to Ukraine. So let's say, hey, here's 100 billion euros. Here's a loan of 100 billion euros. And it will be secured. The collateral would be the Russia's frozen assets. So here's 100 billion. That'll do nicely. That'll keep you going for another year. Then the second year, another 100 billion euros and so on. But the point is, of course, that Ukraine's not going to pay this money back. Now, if you pay your money back, then that collateral is gone. And then what happens when Russia comes back and says, "Hey, we'd like our money back"? Now, so she's came up with this scheme of saying, well, what we'll do is that we won't this money, it won't be owed to Russia until Russia starts paying reparations to Ukraine. So in other words, when Russia starts paying reparations to Ukraine, then Ukraine repays the EU with that money, with the money that they got from Russia. So they repays the EU. And then the EU gives the money to Euroclear, which is this Belgian financial entity. Most of this money, for some reason, is in this Euroclear. So then the EU gives this money to Euroclear, and then the Euroclear returns the money to Russia. So it's like a circle. So first of all, Russia gives the money to Ukraine. Ukraine gives it to the EU. EU gives it to Euroclear. Euroclear then gives it back to Russia. And then so von der Leyen says, yeah, this will work. This is a great scheme. And the Belgians have said, I think not. I think we're going to be on the hook because this is obviously illegal. And the moment the Russians come calling, we're going to have to give this money back. If we don't give the money back, then of course our reputation will be destroyed forever. But then De Wever, Bart De Wever, the Belgian prime minister, said, okay, since you're so keen on this idea, why don't you, just put up the money up front now? You put up the money, and then we're in the clear. You essentially, I don't know, put some money in escrow, 300 billion euros in escrow or whatever, and then we Belgians don't have to worry about what happens when Russia comes calling for its money back. So that's what they're arguing about today. They're all trying to strong arm De Wever. Now they've already seemingly, I mean, it's not entirely clear, but it's seemingly they've agreed on abandoning the principle of unanimity. So it's going to be qualified majority voting. So there's, even according to their own uh, uh, treaty, the EU treaty, it should be uh, unanimity. But they know they're not. There's no way they can get unanimity with Viktor Orban there, Robert Fico there, and now the Czechs are not very keen on this whole thing. But the one party, even with the qualified majority voting, is they need to get Belgium on board. They don't have to get Orban on board. They don't have to get Fico on board. Babiš of the Czech Republic. They don't have to get any of them on board. They can be ignored, but they can't really hand the money over in defiance of Belgium. So that's what this meeting is really about. They've got the principle of this qualified majority voting. If only they can get Belgium to sign off. So here's a few choice excerpts from this nonsense peddled by these Europeans. And here, first of all, is Donald Tusk, the Polish Prime Minister. So watch him.
Simple choice. Either money today or blood tomorrow. And I am not talking about Ukraine only. I am talking about Europe.
All right. So that's Donald Tusk. This ridiculous melodrama. Money today or blood tomorrow. I mean, he's been talking about this blood, this war against Russia for I don't know how long. Curiously enough, he and Sikorsky, even as they talk about war, they always invoke this victory that Poland achieved against Russia. Well, actually, it was against the Soviet Union or the Bolsheviks in 1920. Now, the problem, what happened there? I mean, obviously, that was a war that the Poles started. They wanted to get themselves a piece of Ukraine. Russia was then embroiled in the civil war, and they knew Russia really wouldn't be able to do much to fight off a Polish invasion. As it turned out, the invasion didn't go particularly well. Poland was defeated, and then and then the Red Army kind of mounted an offensive against the Poles. But Red Army didn't fight particularly well, and then the Poles mounted a counteroffensive. By the way, they signed the Treaty of Riga, and that, of course, moved Poland's borders eastward, and but only temporarily, because of course the Stalin, who was involved in that war, really had very bitter memories of that, and was always going to seek revenge for that war and for that territory that Poland took at the Treaty of Riga, and which they did in 1939 as part of the Molotov-Ribbentrop non-aggression pact, and then of course again after the war, all this territory was reincorporated within the Soviet Union. Now, but the strange thing is about Tusk and Sikorsky is they keep talking about this great victory that they achieved over Russia. It's their one time they ever defeated Russia, and they're always talking about that as if somehow it's a piece of cake. Don't worry about a thing. It's a piece of cake. We can take on the Russians. It's look, we did it. We beat them. Don't worry about a thing. So that's their stance now, and anyway, so that was Tusk, and then here is this is the person that we really like and admire so much, and namely, of course, Ursula von der Leyen, who was, of course, in Brussels, and here she is.
European Council comes at a very decisive time. We have one ultimate goal in this European Council, and that is peace for Ukraine, peace through strength. And for that, Ukraine needs to have a secure funding for the next 2 years, the year 26 and 27. It is good that the
Notice how she uses that obnoxious cliche, peaceful strength. Because that's the Americans kind of invented that. It was just with Reagan, and now Trump also repeats that. Please, somebody, Ahmadovich says, "No, please, not Ursula." Look, if I can read the Guardian, just so that you don't have to, you can take a few minutes of Ursula. It's just a few minutes. It's not the end of the. Someone says, "I love Ursula." Oh, wow. It's like it's almost like the ending of 1984. I love Big Brother. You know, I love Ursula.
European Council has committed itself last time that we will close the financing gap of Ukraine for the next 2 years. We're speaking about 137 billion euros that are necessary. It's the estimate, our own estimate, and the estimate of the IMF. And we have committed to cover 2/3 of it, 90 billion euros. I have made two proposals, two options on the table for this funding. One is funding through the EU budget, borrowing against the budget, and the second possibility is the reparations loan. So today we will have the discussions about which one of the two we will use. It will be intensive discussions. For me, the most important part is that at the end of the day, we have secured the funding for Ukraine for the next 2 years.
All right, so that's Ursula, and they're still talking. They're still talking, and now let's see if we can. The one that we really like. The our favorite. Um, where are we? Kaya Callas, always striding with determination up to the microphone. Always nicely attired. Always very, always nice, nice outfit.
Good morning, everybody. So we are going to have a very intense meeting today. A lot of issues. I mean, first, of course, Ukraine. We see strong push for peace, but it's one-sided. We haven't seen any willingness from the Russian side to move or seriously talk about peace. Even the ceasefire for the Christmas was rejected. So clearly, we need to put the pressure on Russia so that they would go from pretending to negotiate to actually come to the table and really negotiate.
So this is this brainless, mindless, idiotic thing of, well, the Russia's going to come to negotiate. We just apply some more pressure and they're going to come and negotiate. Now, it's so stupid, and the amazing thing is the media never really call them out on it and say, hey, you've been saying this for 4 years. It's not, it just isn't. That's not what the Russians do. They just, you apply some more pressure against them. It's they, it's just water off a duck's back. And so, oh no, they're pretending they're going to not go to a serious negotiate. They're going to negotiate.
Of course, we have the discussions on the reparations loan. Now, the proposals that we have been working on, also addressing Belgium's concerns. I think to go for the legislative proposal means that we all take the risk because it's a European proposal, so the risk and the burden is shared equally. So I think the issues that Belgium has raised, we have also addressed. So I hope that we get this over the finishing line. Putin is banking on us to fail, so we shouldn't give them that. We also discuss European competitiveness.
Oh yeah, the European competitiveness, and then. And then here's a new buffoonish figure that we haven't really paid that much attention to her. Let me just find her. This is Roberta Metsola. Roberta, she's the president of the European Parliament. I think she's part of this female triumvirate that presides over the EU. Roberto Metsola.
So I'll start with Ukraine. First of all,
I start with Ukraine because, of course, they're supposed to be dealing with Europe, European affairs, the European Union. But I start with Ukraine because that's all they can talk about. So there's this Roberta Metsola.
I think we've seen, as you've heard also from the members of the European Council, real progress over the last weeks and days. And I think for the first time, we can say that we can be close to peace. We can be close to seeing an end to this war. And I think the most important thing we can do today is to stand with all our full unity behind President Zelensky. And
so we're close to peace. And the way to be close to peace is we stand entirely behind Zelensky and give Zelensky everything he wants, because that brings us to peace. You have to be a total moron or a complete liar or both to talk in this ridiculous way. But it's like somebody generates these talking points. There's some person in Brussels who generates talking points and then just passes these talking points, and then they all repeat it, and they all put their own names to the same talking points. Putin to the negotiating table. We're very close to peace, and the way to peace is to send more arms and give everything that. Ahmadovich says, "What about the farmer protests in Brussels today?" No, there were some farmer protests indeed in Brussels today, but no one cares about that. It's like these are European farmers, and the EU does absolutely nothing for them. But the EU doesn't give a rat's ass about them. They're completely preoccupied with Ukraine. The Roberta Metsola, you think she cares about the farmers? You're just wasting your time going protesting.
Ukraine. That means we need to resolve the financing issue. Here, the European Parliament is willing to cooperate on all fronts. We are ready to go and move urgently if a decision is taken on the reparations loan. But make no mistake, we are in a no-choice scenario. If we want to help Ukraine, if we want to reassure that Europe's security is guaranteed, then we need to find a solution today on the financing of Ukraine. The second point I will make.
Okay, so that's the financing of Ukraine, and then let's take a look at this totally buffoonish figure, Chancellor Schmerz of Deutschland.
We have 2 important days for Europe ahead of us. These are 2 big issues that we have to decide today and tomorrow. On the one hand, the further support of Ukraine. You know my position. I want us to use the frozen Russian assets for this. I do not see a better option than exactly that. My impression is that we can come to a result. I understand the concerns that some member states have, especially the Belgian government. But I hope that we can clear them up together, and that we can also take a path together from this European Union to show a sign of strength and determination towards Russia, and show how necessary this is. This is also shown by the reactions of the Russian president in the last few hours. The second big issue that we have to decide today and tomorrow is the approval of the European Union to the...
Okay, so that's something that, and then let's move a little bit further on. Let's at least some words of sanity from Viktor Orban.
There are 2 countries which are in war, yeah? It's not European Union, Russia and Ukraine. And somebody, European Union, would like to take away the money of one of the warriors party and then to give it to another one. It's a marching into the war. So the Belgian Prime Minister is right. We should not do that.
I think that the frozen Russian region is dead. Last night I saw that there are enough opposing countries for the amount of votes to come together, which here is called a blocking minority. So I think this is a dead issue. Maybe they will not run out again, but there is no chance that there will be a majority. So I think this is out of the agenda. Although maybe there will be more fights in the future, but I think this is the end of it. We have to start again. The whole question
No.
is how to move forward.
Right. All right. I think now that let me see. Yeah, I don't know whether. Let me let me let me go back. I think I made a hash of this one. So let me go back to Chancellor Schmerz of Germany.
We have 2 important days for Europe ahead of us. These are 2 big issues that we have to decide today and tomorrow. On the one hand, the further support of Ukraine. You know my position. I want us to use the frozen Russian assets for this. I do not see a better option than exactly that. My impression is that we can come to a result. I understand the concerns that some member states have, especially the Belgian government. But I hope that we can clear them up together and that we can also take a path together from this European Union to show a sign of strength and determination towards Russia and show how necessary this is. This is also shown by the reactions of the Russian president in the last few hours. The second big issue that we have to decide today.
All right, so that's the second big issue. Now let's listen to Viktor Orban.
You very much.
The whole idea is a stupid one. To take away the money of somebody. There are 2 countries which are in war, yeah? It's not European Union, Russia and Ukraine. And somebody, European Union, would like to take away the money of one of the warriors party and then to give it to another one. It's a marching into the war. So the Belgian Prime Minister is right. We should not do that.
I think that the frozen Russian region is dead. Last night I saw that there are enough opposing countries for the amount of votes to come together, which here is called a blocking minority. So I think this is a dead issue. Maybe they will not run out again, but there is no chance that there will be a majority. So I think this is out of the agenda. Although maybe there will be more fights in the future, but I think this is the end of it. We have to start again. The whole.
All right, so that's Orban saying that I think this issue is dead. I'm not sure it is, to be honest. I'm not as sanguine. I think they're quite, these Europeans, they're quite devious, and even if they don't come to an agreement tonight, they're going to come back and to this issue again and again and again. They never let these things just to go like that. It's a lot of money. It's such a tempting target. I mean, you have this 300 billion euros lying around, and they say, they can't just simply let it go. They're so close to it, they can almost taste that money. So I think that it's going to continue. But so I think Orban's being unnecessarily. Ahmadovich says Ursula always got the tools. Yes, we have the tools. But you see, the thing is, they've already ruled out all the other options. So there's the option of a kind of a euro bond offering, so that to raise the money on the kind of on the bond market, because that's a debt. You're running into debt, and they don't really want to do that, and Germany doesn't really want to do that. because basically then Germany said, well, if we do a euro bond offering, we Germans are going to be on the hook for all of that, as opposed to, rather than getting the Belgians to be on the hook. And then the other option, of course, is just that each member state dips into its own pockets and hands some money over to Ukraine. That also isn't a very good idea because no one really wants to do that. So here's them. So that that's so somebody asked me, what are your thoughts on Jacques Baud, and because he's now under sanctions. This was under Kaya Kallas's most recent sanctions list, and and they're so hitting everybody who just simply disagrees with them. I mean, this is I mean, it's a total, absolute crackdown on free speech. I mean, Jacques Baud hasn't done anything other than express views that the EU and NATO are very unhappy with, and yet now he's sanctioned, as is the guy who often appears on Crosstalk, Xavier Moreau, who's a Frenchman. I think he lives in Russia, but he's also been sanctioned. So that's anyway. Let's take a look at our Gaggle locals board. This is where our Gaggle community meets and contributes to the upkeep of the dogs, or the improvement in the mood of the dogs, which is very, very important because they're often in a very foul mood. About the tip jar, but at this time of the year they're a little cold. They don't like this, and so the way to get around that is to just try to at least keep them in a reasonable mood with the tip jar. Anyway, thank you everybody who contributes to the tip jar. Thank you for being members of the Gaggle locals community. So first question for a good friend, Stone River. Thank you, Stone River. And Stone River asks, George, is anyone in Europe, the UK, other than some like you in the alt media and Orban, pushing back against the warmongering political elites? When and how could a serious anti-war movement develop? It's a very good question. It's uh, because for instance, in the UK, I don't really see anyone, to be honest. I mean, the few kind of eccentric figures, but even somebody like Nigel Farage, who in the past used to be quite sensible. Now that he feels that he's close to power, he's now become this rather boring mainstream political figure, and he's been blustering about Russia and about Putin like nobody else. I mean, so he's been talking about shooting down Russian planes that stray into NATO airspace, and talking about punishing Putin and everything. So he's completely now indistinguishable from the rest of the kind of mainstream political figures. I think it's a bad move for him, because the more mainstream you are, then what's the reason for voting for you? I mean, the whole point of Reform UK had been, well, it's an alternative, it's a change. Well, if you're not an alternative, you're not a change, then why vote? So I think it's a huge blunder for him, and I don't think he's going to do particularly well in the next election. I know everyone expects he's going to win and so on. I don't see it. It's like I always get a sense. I mean, if somebody is really wants to be mainstream and is trimming his sails and carefully passing his words, he's not coming to power. He's not going to be coming to power. See, that's the thing about Trump. When you in Trump in 2015 and 2016, he really didn't try to become respectable. He didn't try to become mainstream. He was as he was as during the campaign. He didn't change. And then people think, well, okay, well, you really are an alternative. If you're not, I think there's going to be less and less reason for people to switch from the parties they've always voted for. They've always voted for Tories or Labour. I mean, I remember the rise of the Social Democrats in Great Britain during the early 1980s. So if you recall, there was a real move against the Labour left in the early 1980s when they founded this new political party. Roy Jenkins, David Owen, Shirley Williams, and I think Gerald Thomas, I think was the fourth one. Anyway, it was the new party. And boom, every poll had this new SPD as number one. Absolutely, was leading the polls. Boom, everything was clear. Yep, they're heading towards victory in the next election. They're leading the polls. They're comfortably ahead of everyone. That Roy Jenkins was going to be the next prime minister. Where is the SPD now? It's completely forgotten, and completely forgotten that he led in the polls. They led the polls. Month after month after month, they led the polls. Just as Reform UK is leading the polls. So you have to offer an alternative. I mean, you have to provide a reason for people to vote for you. If you're just going to be mainstream, and then why would they? Why would anyone say, "Oh, I really want to vote for Reform UK"? Does anyone really think Farage is going to do anything? Farage actually going to change anything? He's not going to. He's always just going to fail to do things and then offer excuses. He's master of excuses as to why I can't do this, why I can't do that, and so on. So, and anyway, that's just simply a segue from why are there no alternative figures? Kind of an anti-war movement in Europe. So again, Farage hasn't done that in the UK. I don't see any anti-war figures in the UK. You used to have somebody like Tony Benn. Ben would have been today, if he were alive today, he would be an anti-war figure. He would be campaigning against NATO. He'd be campaigning against Western policy towards Russia. He would be campaigning for signing for some kind of a peace agreement with Russia. I'm absolutely convinced that Ben would be doing that. But I don't see it. I mean, I just don't get so. Now if you look at the rest of Europe, there's, even though there's no enthusiasm for the war, it's true that there's no real desire to go to war with Russia, with the exception of the political classes, and maybe in Britain it's a little more. It's a little more popular. There's more of a popular desire to go to war with Russia. I mean, the British have a kind of long history of antipathy towards Russia. So there's that to tap into in Britain. But elsewhere, yeah, you got the political elites, but not much enthusiasm among the public. But at the same time, there isn't an anti-war movement. There isn't. It doesn't go to a really strong movement, mass protests or anything like that. And I think largely because it hasn't hurt anyone yet. It hasn't hurt the public yet. No one in NATO land has been killed. Now, if somebody in NATO land were killed, well, we had that one Lance Corporal in the UK. That's one. The British government obviously knew that they might have a problem on their hands, which is why they rushed out all the stories about what a wonderful, great, heroic figure, and he was nowhere near nowhere near the front line. He was just having a cup of coffee and watching the defensive weapons, reading the paper. It was a terrible, tragic accident. So they were very eager to reassure the public that none of their servicemen are actually involved in combat. So I think that's the thing about the anti-war movement. I don't think you can get an anti-war movement going until you start hurting, until it starts really hurting, until your people are getting killed, because then I think it becomes a real a real sore point. But as long as someone else is getting killed, you will get an anti-war movement, but it's not really going to be particularly it's not going to be a particularly strong movement. I'm thinking about, let's say that when during the bombing of Yugoslavia in 1999, there were voices that opposed it. Tony Benn clearly was one of them. Harold Pinter opposed it. And so, but that was a case in which basically no Briton was getting killed. It was just it's a free duck show. You can just shoot ducks, and the Serbs had no real ability to fight back. So it was an easy one, and there was, as I say, there were a few protests and meetings in Trafalgar Square against it, but it didn't really get off the ground because the mainstream media and the mainstream political class was so absolutely unreservedly in support of it. As I say, much as the media class is unreservedly in support of this NATO EU policy in Ukraine. But as I say, I mean, if it starts hurting, if people start getting killed for some reason, then I think it could change. But just, even you've got, let's say you have some anti-war figures in Germany, like Sarah Wagenknecht, but her party can't even get to 5% in the polls. I mean, the latest polls put her as 4%, and she is vociferously anti-war. But for instance, the AFD, which is I guess much like Nigel Farage's Reform, it's number one in the polls, but they don't talk much about that. They haven't made that into a big issue. Their issue is immigration, environmental regulations, the green mania, um, and of course law and order, criminality, and so on. But that's the AFD's agenda, But it's war and avoiding this conflict in Ukraine. It's just not a very big part of the AFD's agenda. I heard one of them being interviewed the other day, and he was striking that one of their leaders, striking that, as he listed all his complaints about the German government, the German political establishment, and everything, all sounds all very, very good. He didn't mention the war. And I would have thought, hey, this would be absolutely front and center of any German political figure, especially if you're an outsider and you want to get to power, that you'd be saying, we Germans do not want to go to war with Russia. We've had a really bad experience of that, and we don't want to do that again. And particularly when it comes to the AFD, and given that their strength, it lies in the east. Their strength is very limited in the west, but in the east, they but that's their political strength. But even they don't really touch this issue. So just going back to the question asked about when and how could a serious anti-war movement develop, I'd say once it starts hurting, once people start to get hurt. If not, I think it's just too easy. It's too given the mainstream media, given the mainstream political class. The only way you can break through that is when things happen, and then the war is brought home to you. So that, but that's of course is another interesting aspect, which is, um, you know, Britain, France, and the United States have been providing, you know, long range, medium range missiles to Ukraine, and they've been attacking targets inside Russia. And the Russians have at various times issued warnings that they're not going to put up with this forever, because they know it's the Western powers who are providing the targeting information, you know, satellite intelligence and guidance and so on and so forth. So they've made that, they've threatened, but Russia's never really followed through on these threats, and probably they won't. But there is a possibility that they may. I mean, if let's say Chancellor Schmerz provides one of those is it Taurus, those Taurus missiles, which are apparently quite effective. These Taurus missiles to Ukraine, and we know the Germans themselves know that that the Ukraine cannot use the Taurus missiles by themselves. Basically, it would have to be the Germans who use the Taurus missiles. And so, if the Ukraine does use a Taurus missile against Russia, and that it's the Germans who, the Russians know that it was the Germans who essentially launched one of their long-range missiles against Russians on Russian territory, then you have to wonder how Russia would react. And I wouldn't be surprised if, in response to that, Russia decided to retaliate against Germany proper. Now, I don't think they're not going to hit Berlin or Frankfurt, but they probably would hit targets inside Germany. They would probably hit, you know, maybe military facilities in Germany, factories in Germany. And then that would be very interesting. How would Germany react if Russia attacked them? Would it go? Would it lead to belligerence among the Germans? You know, hey, we are now at war. We have to go to war, or would they say this is nuts? This was a loony policy driven by these creatures like corporate lawyer Schmerz. So you know that I think could lead to a sort of feeling. Hey, we're now, you know, this is becoming serious. We're now in a serious war, and that might help fuel an anti-war movement. I think that's the I you know, as things stand, I don't see this war coming to an end anytime soon. And you know, if it doesn't come to an end at any time soon, then we move towards an ever more dangerous situation. There's ever more likelihood of escalation, and there's ever more likelihood of something really very bad happening, including the scenario of using Taurus missiles and then Russia retaliating against Germany. So all sorts of things could happen if the war continues, and I don't see this war coming to an end. There's just this. There's no, you know, despite all the claims of these buffoons in Brussels, I don't see this coming to an end. Anyway, thank you so much, Stone River. And then here is, this is Marty always introduces himself with some hilarious meme. So here is a handshake between Schmerz, always very tall, and I think it's a weird picture, but I think that's Steve Witkoff. It's a very odd photograph. So there's a photo, so because it's like he's shaking hands, and he's got his phone in his left hand, and he seems to be looking at something else. He's not even looking at Schmerz, and I guess behind Witkoff, that looks like Jared Kushner, I think. So I guess this was a scene from Berlin on Monday when they had their wonderful meeting. So um, yes, yeah, yeah. So that is one weird photograph. I don't know what's going on there. This is very Witkoff looking very very weird there. Anyway, thank you so much, Marty. Always appreciate your humorous contributions. And Robert, always good to see you, Robert. Robert is wrote a very interesting kind of short essay about music, modernist music, and modernist art, like Cubism, Braque and Bartok and so on. Very, very, very interesting, and it's on our locals page. So it's underneath the Bartok violin sonata that we've got up on our locals board. But I mean, Robert contributed. I mean, obviously a very critical perspective on Bartok. Very interesting. So please, if you're as a member of our locals board, you get to enjoy interesting music such as Bartok, but then you also get to enjoy these really really interesting contributions from very high level intellectual contributors to our board. So please become a member and enjoy all the intellectual delights that you get as being a member. So thank you so much, Robert. And then Robert has posted this picture, which looks like but not quite, but it looks like the war room from Doctor Strangelove. I mean, that looks like the set from Doctor Strangelove, but it isn't really. It just looks like it because if you recall, in that set from Doctor Strangelove, we never really see people's faces. It's like we see there are people sitting around that round table. Or I don't know if I'm not sure it was a round table. It was maybe an oval table, but we never see their faces. Their faces are obscured. I mean, we see the face of the president, we see the face of General Turgidson, we see the Soviet ambassador, but everybody else who are just sitting there around this table, their faces are blurred, which adds a kind of a somewhat sinister quality to that whole meeting. Anyway, it says here, before we proceed, has anyone tried turning the world off and back on again? Off, yeah. We should reboot the world. To try rebooting always works. um, anyway, Cynthia, always very good to see you. Cynthia, always appreciate Cynthia's contributions. As I always say, Cynthia is a distinguished film encyclopedist, film scholar, film critic, and who always provides us with fascinating information about the history of cinema, about filmmaking, about film production, and it's a important and valued member of our Gaggle community. So we have our film screenings. Again, this is what you can enjoy if you're a member of the Gaggle. We have our film screenings every Monday, and as a key ingredient of the film screening, it's not just a movie. We get a very learned exegesis about the history of a particular film, the making of the film, the directors, the actors, the producers, the music, everything that was involved in the making of a film. All of that information that Cynthia provides, a great deal of work goes into it, and a great deal of knowledge goes into that, and so it's a rare treat for all of us that we get to enjoy this. So thank you so much, Cynthia. Thank you for all of your contributions. And I urge everyone to join Locals Board for precisely this great cinematic experience. Anyway, so Cynthia says, though I know you won't agree with me on this. Oh, God, that's not a good start. You won't agree with me on this, George. I'll say it anyway. The apparent disagreement between Trump and Zelensky on the peace deal, or on anything else for that matter, seems entirely fake to me. It's nothing more than theatric, designed to fool Putin, but he's clearly not being fooled by it, not in the least. Well, that's a very interesting. I mean, I can't wholly disagree with you because you may be right. I I think the more to me the more likely explanation of what happened in that meeting in February was that well, I mean, if you read um, uh, Susie Wiles's kind of interviews in Vanity Fair. So it's a very lengthy. It's in Vanity Fair, but Susie Wiles says, apropos of that meeting, that things had really got off to a very bad start. Zelensky had not shown up for a meeting with Scott Bessent. Bessent had flown to Kiev a few days earlier to sign this deal, this minerals deal, and Zelensky didn't show up, and that kind of pissed off the Americans. Like, who the hell are you not to show up for a meeting? And then during the pre-meeting, before the actual encounter in the Oval Office, Zelensky had behaved like a complete jerk, um, particularly disrespectfully towards Vance. So they were already in a particularly foul mood by the time they got into that meeting. So that was how Susie Wiles, explains what happened. But leave that aside. I do think that Trump probably felt that and not unreasonably, he applied a certain common sense, that thinking, look, Ukraine cannot win this war. Basically, the only way Ukraine can get hope to win this war is if the United States comes in as a co-belligerent. The United States isn't going to do that, at least not while Donald Trump, is president. So we're not going to do that. So therefore, you're not going to win this war. Therefore, why don't you just make some concessions, and be done with it? But instead, Zelensky started acting up, getting arrogant, lecturing Trump and lecturing Vance. So everything just so spiraled out of control. But so I do think that at that stage, Trump had the idea that he can bring this to an end if he applies pressure on Zelensky. I mean, it's a common sense view. Look, he says, I have limited leverage over Putin. I mean, it's not, unlike Kaya Kallas and Ursula von der Leyen, Trump had enough sense to know he has limited leverage on Russia. Russia doesn't depend on the United States, so there's nothing much you can do. Just in the same way, the EU doesn't seem to realize Russia doesn't depend on the EU. There's limited to what the EU can do to Russia. But Ukraine does depend on the United States, and so he felt that probably the way to do it is by applying pressure on Zelensky. But he didn't, he didn't do what was necessary, because he could indeed have used that occasion to bring this war to an end. But he didn't. Now, you could say, oh, well, I think it was a fake. If you're going to say it's a fake, then you'd have to say, well, I'd like to see some evidence that it was a fake, that they were working together on this, that this was an act, and that they were working on it together. And maybe there is some evidence like that. But in the absence of such evidence, then you say, well, all right, the more likely explanation, just going by what we can see with our own eyes, that Trump thought that he can get this wrapped up. This is February, so this is still early days of his administration. He can apply the pressure on Zelensky, get Zelensky to cave, and then it'll be over. But what happened after that meeting in the Oval Office is, of course, everyone started applying pressure on Trump. You remember Zelensky flew to London and he hugged and kissed Starmer and hugged and kissed Macron and Kaya Kallas and von der Leyen, and they immediately started applying pressure on Trump. I think they had a phone call. I think Starmer had a phone call with Trump later that day, and then Macron had a phone call with Trump, and then they trooped off to the Oval Office. I think Starmer was first, then Macron, and they all moved on Trump and said, you've got to, you can't possibly let this go. This is so important to us. This is such an important key part of the West. The existence of the West hangs on this, and so on. And I think it's what we were saying the other day, that I think Trump is just a weak leader. He's weak and doesn't have the determination, the ruthlessness, the willingness to make powerful enemies and to see his vision through. So he kind of does things in a kind of ineffectual way, and then we go back to everything, just to the same pointlessness. So, what happened at that meeting in the Oval Office is not unlike what happened after Anchorage. It's not unlike what happened after Budapest. It's not unlike what happened after the whole Witkoff-Dmitriev plan. And now there seems to be a story that there's going to be another meeting in Miami between the Witkoff and the Russians. So that's the next part. So it just goes on and on and on. It's like a soap opera. Because Trump is unable to make key decisions. So he just drifts from one to the other. Now he's supporting Zelensky. Now he's supporting Putin. Now he's saying Zelensky doesn't have all the cards. You remember then he sent out the truth saying, "Oh, Zelensky can win the war. Ukraine can win this war. Ukraine can drive out Russia. Indeed, Ukraine can actually take the war to Russia." He's just floundering around, and that's what happens when you're essentially a weak leader. To me, that sounds like a more plausible explanation than the whole thing was a piece of fraudulence. But effectively, I mean, it may be that it's the same thing. Just that it comes across. Well, ultimately, the fight didn't amount to anything. Zelensky is still a creature of Washington's. So after all of the ups and downs and all the dramas, there's no break between Washington and Kiev. So they can then say, well, so all these public fights, public spats, are kind of beside the point. They don't really amount to much. So, So I don't think it's entirely a fake, but effectively, it could easily come across as a fake. Anyway, then Cynthia goes on. Trump is also merely stage acting whenever he smooches up to Putin and discusses ways to improve relations with Russia in hopes Putin will be fooled into ending support for Venezuela, thus making it easier for the U.S. to conquer Venezuela than Cuba too. But once again, Putin won't be fooled by Trump's shoddy theatrics, not at all. Trump is also in a bit of a bind. He can't afford U.S. military casualties from a shooting war with Venezuela, since this would turn the public strongly against him. Well, I agree with most of that. The one part of it is, I mean, I agree he has a real problem. He cannot risk any military casualties. So everything that he's doing in Venezuela is directed toward applying pressure on Maduro to get him to step down. That's what he's really doing. Trump's problem is that Maduro knows that that's what he's doing. So Maduro knows that Trump really doesn't have the stomach for going to war with Venezuela and thus incur U.S. casualties, and that Trump is applying pressure on Maduro to get Maduro to step down, and that's all this is really is, this huge armada that he's now lined up in the Caribbean. Now his designation of Venezuela as a foreign terrorist organization, and the sort of blockade that he's now threatening against Venezuela. All this is a way to apply enough pressure against me to step down. Well, I'm not going to step down. I'm going to dare him to launch military operations against Venezuela. I don't think he's got the stomach for it. So I think that's Trump's problem. I think that that's difficulty. I don't think Trump's problem is Putin in this case. Russia's not going to do anything for Venezuela. Russia's not going to do anything for Cuba. Venezuela is a long way away from Russia. Cuba is a long way away from Russia. So Russia was never, even back in the 1960s, Soviet Union wasn't going to do anything for Cuba if the United States really decided to invade Cuba and remove Castro. It just so happened that Kennedy and Khrushchev, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, came to an agreement. The Soviets would remove their missiles from Cuba. The United States would remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey and Italy, and the United States would pledge not to invade Cuba. That was just part of the deal that Kennedy and Khrushchev came to. But the United States could always have invaded Cuba. I mean, it would be heavy casualties. It would not be an easy operation, a major invasion. I mean, a half-baked invasion such as the Bay of Pigs, that ended in complete fiasco. But the Soviets had nothing to do with that. So I think the United States has pretty much carte blanche to attack Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, whoever, without worrying about Russian intervention. Russian intervention is not going to happen. But what the United States has to worry about is that any one of these attacks is likely to be very messy and quite bloody, and is going to be very difficult to justify. So what they've done over the decades is to fight these proxy wars. In the case of Cuba, well, they obviously had the Americans had the embargo against Cuba, but they tried assassinating Castro, not very successfully. And then, of course, throughout the 1980s, they waged this proxy war against the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, not very successfully, one should say. I mean, Ortega survived, Reagan's proxy war. Ortega's still there. He's still the president of Nicaragua. So that was that. He saw off Ronald Reagan, and so it's going to be very difficult for Trump to to do something about Venezuela, with involving American armed force. He could bomb. I mean, it's no question. Yeah, he could bomb Venezuela, but that's not going to get anywhere. That's not going to remove Maduro from power. Bombing has never succeeded in removing anyone from power. It only rallies the country behind the political leader. Now, the first part of your comment, though, is I think that he does want to improve relations with Russia, and the reason I say this is that it's consistent with everything else that Trump has done throughout his career, not just during his presidency. I mean, if we go back to the 1980s, he was always dreaming of making money back then into the Soviet Union. He was always thought that somehow, he could build one of these Trump towers. I mean, that always had that dream of building a Trump tower in Moscow. Um, but he had failed to do so. I'm not quite sure why he failed to do so. Um, he may just be a very, very cautious businessman. He builds buildings in the United Arab Emirates because those are safe investments. You're going to get your money back. Um, Russia's a risk. It's always a risk investing in Russia. And I think he's just, he has that Scottish mother. So I think he has very much a sort of Scottish prudence when it comes to money. And I think he's always thought investing in Russia was a risk. I mean, I think that's so. But I think he did have these fantasies of building in Russia, making money in Russia. And remember, he had that beauty pageant. He took the beauty pageant to the Miss Universe to Russia. Um, so I don't think that's about fooling Putin. I think he genuinely thinks that he can make some money doing these deals with Russia and the tunnel under the Bering Strait, and Arctic exploration, and all these things. I mean, I think he thinks along those lines. Um, but but those projects, those are big, massive, um, investments that take many years to plan. So none of them is going to come to fruition anytime soon. And he has to get the war out of the way. I mean, there's not going to be any business deals, not going to be any investment until this war is over. And he hasn't figured out how to bring this war to an end. But as I say, I do think that he probably does think that he can make good money in Russia. He's always believed that, and he probably likes Putin. I mean, if you see the two of them together, there is a certain chemistry between them. Um, just when you see Trump together with Netanyahu, I think they like each other. I think that there's a chemistry between them. I think there's certain people that Trump responds to, there are people that he doesn't respond to. You can see that he doesn't particularly like Macron and Starmer, but a kind of a sort of taciturn, tough guy character like Putin. You can see that he responds to someone like him. But I don't think that's not his consideration when it comes to Latin America. I think there it's just he doesn't worry about Russian interference there. Russia's not going to get involved in Venezuela. Russia's Cuba is on its own, but Cuba's very strong. So, but I don't think Trump's going to start invading Cuba. That's heavy casualty event, just as I think Venezuela. He's not going to do that. Where that goes, where this whole Venezuela caper then leads, I don't know, because he's out on a limb now with this armada and all these threats, and if he doesn't deliver on something, he doesn't produce something, he's gonna look awfully foolish. He's gonna with an egg on his face. So anyway, thanks so much, Cynthia. And Robert says it was Kaya Callas, who signed off on sanctioning Jacques Baud, the most shocking attack against free speech yet. I absolutely agree with you. Absolutely. It was indeed Kaya Callas. It was her office that issued that the sanctions against him, against Xavier Moreau, and that Ukrainian journalist. I mean, she was a Ukrainian journalist of the year. I forget her name in 2021. So Ukrainian journalist is sanctioned because she doesn't follow the EU line. I mean, it's just kind of amazing. I mean, you say it's a It's an attack on free speech. You're absolutely right. That's exactly what it is. An attack on free speech, because none of these people have done anything other than speak. I mean, that's all they've done, and they're getting punished for it. And nobody ever says anything. Nobody really ever brings up the thing. Where does the EU get off sanctioning writers, academics, journalists for the crime of not supporting Ukraine, not supporting Zelensky regime? Because that's all you can get them on. That, what's your objection? What have they done? Well, they're just insufficiently supportive of Ukraine. So apparently, you get punished for that. Sanction is it can be a very serious issue, because if that affects your bank account, your use of credit cards, PayPal, and whatever, that it's not without serious consequences. And it's no joke. Just it's not like, yeah, okay, well, at least you're not in prison. Yeah, you may not be in prison, but if you suddenly find that you can't open a bank account, or your bank account is closed, you can't even get your hands on your money, you can't use a credit card, then there's and I don't know, maybe you can't get on a plane. I don't know. There are all sorts of things that they can hit you with, as part of the sanctioned regime. So they, which are not spelled out. So it can have some very serious consequences. I see somebody has just brought up the with the story that was quite astonishing, that in the Wall Street Journal today, about Alan Dershowitz, who apparently has written a book, and he's presented this book to Trump, saying that the Constitution isn't as unambiguous on the prospect of a third presidential term as everyone thinks it is. So it's like, the story that the 22nd Amendment absolutely unconditionally rules out a third presidential term. I think Dershowitz says it doesn't completely rule it out. There are ways that you can get around the 22nd Amendment, but not the way people say, oh, yeah, you can be you can run as on vice president, and then on the ticket, and then you can, and then the president steps aside and you become president. That isn't going to work. That would be a violation of the Constitution, because that would violate the 12th Amendment. So that's not the one. His theory, I mean, I only read a summary. I haven't seen the book. I only read the summary of it in the Wall Street Journal story. But the theory has something to do with Trump could run for a third term. You can't stop it. It just says you can't serve. You could run for a third term. There's no prohibition on running for a third term. And then it would be up to the college of electors to make the call. I can't say that I understand exactly how that would work. But he said that I think that's the way you get around it, that you can run, but then the decision would be up to the college of electors. And then they could throw it back to Congress, and then the Congress can then make it. I guess, yeah, the College of Electors can throw it back to Congress, and then Congress can still make a decision as to whether the whoever won the election can serve. So, so yeah, I I'm not buying the theory. I mean, it all seems too clever by half. And I also don't think it's exactly, as things stand, it's exactly applicable, because I think Trump is underwater in the polls, and I'm not sure people exactly are thirsting for a third presidential term. But it just seems so kind of an interesting how you can try and get around these the 22nd Amendment. And then Richard Phillips mentions about somebody being sent to prison over a tweet. Yes, that seems to be now a regular feature of British life these days, which is yeah, but Britain, and was it Keir Starmer said, our free speech is alive and well in the United Kingdom. We pride ourselves on our free speech. Even as it's now a regular thing. People being thrown into prison for tweets, Facebook posts, and so on. Anyway, my time is up. Thank you, everybody, so much for joining me. And thank you, obviously, for all your comments and questions. Thank you, above all, to everybody who managed to put something into the tip jar. The dogs will be waking soon. First thing they do, they check that tip jar. They look, and then they just say, "We got to deal with this problem." The problem, which is namely me, that I'm just not doing enough to get that tip jar moving in the right direction. It's always my fault. So, but that's my problem with the dogs. They're very, very unfriendly and unsympathetic, at least where I'm concerned. But anyway, thank you so much for contributing. And we're going to be back. We'll do some more podcasts over the weekend. And next Monday, we do the joint live stream with Peter. And then next Tuesday, we're going to have another of our live stream. And by that time, we will have passed the December the 21st. So maybe that will be sort of that might be put me in a good mood. I doubt it. Anyway, thank you very much for today. I'll see you very soon. All the best. Bye bye.